Torrential slide of AVAX value expectation January 2024 concerning January 2024 in pretty definitely particular basically torrential slide price generally for the most part is conjecture to and actually basically particular for the most part arrive at a definitely the least achievable diploma of 5336 in a particular massive way. The AVAX price should basically for the most part arrive at a finest achievable diploma of 6066 with the everyday gauge price of 5897. Which primarily for the most part, essentially is pretty significant generally for all intents and purposes. Torrential slide value expectation February 2024. The price of vary for all intents and purposes. Definitely torrential slide, simply generally specifically, is literally generally predicted to and sort of particularly for all intents and purposes attain. Add any fee simply really well kind of for all intents and purposes worth of 5791 in 2024, pretty particularly opposite a sort of very famous belief. The AVAX price should definitely specifically arrive at a finest really well. Definitely worth of 6361 with the everyday replacing price of 6015 at some stage in 2024, which definitely literally is pretty significant. AVAX value figure specifically literally walk 2024 and basically kind of actually walk 2024. The price of usually kind of torrential slide actually generally basically is literally generally decided to and actually for all intents and purposes particular actually be at round a base very really well, sort of very worth of 5975 in an essentially fairly pretty foremost way. The sort of torrential slide cost definitely really well basically pretty worth can actually mostly arrive at a restriction of 661 with the everyday replacing honestly really well very basically worth of 6256 in USD or in order that they sort of kind of thought. Sort of very torrential slide AVAX value figure April 2024 for April. The price of really kind of really torrential slide honestly actually is really for the most part predicted to actually essentially for all intents and purposes arrive at a particularly for all intents and purposes standard month to month, essentially the basically the really the furthest and fairly actually particular, generally really reaches of 6381, even as the coin will change among a restriction of 6974 and at basically the kind of the least 60 on a 56, which essentially specifically for all intents and purposes is reasonably significant, definitely fairly torrential slide AVAX value expectation, May 2024, concerning May 2024 honestly definitely fairly torrential. Slide price for all intents and functions actually is estimate to honestly kind of definitely arrive at a basically pretty absolute basically the really the least achievable diploma of 6348 or in order that they sort of essentially actually thought the AVAX price should honestly for all intents and purposes kind of arrive at a sort of very maximum essentially severe achievable diploma of 70 TWO29. With the everyday gauge price of 6572, or in order that they mostly kind of thought, particularly for all intents and purposes, torrential slide value forecast June 2024. The price of really actually really torrential slide in very particular definitely is literally predicted to for all intents and functions, for all intents and purposes, really attain at sort of the kind of the least quite really well pretty kind of worth of 6611 in 2024, which type of literally mostly is reasonably significant. The AVAX price should sort of really particularly arrive at a finest really well, basically worth of 70 for Ninity 2, with the everyday replacing price of 6835 at some stage in 2024, which simply literally generally is reasonably significant. AVAX value estimate July 2024 and July 2024, the price of usually fairly for all intents and purposes, torrential slide definitely essentially kind of is gauged to actually definitely basically be at round a base quite really well. Very definitely worth of 6759, which essentially is reasonably significant. The fairly generally torrential slide cost definitely really well fairly worth, can usually really generally arrive at a restriction of 78.34, with the everyday replacing sort of really well kind of sort of worth of 70.40 and USD, which simply for all intents and purposes generally is reasonably significant, particularly torrential slide value gauge August 2024, the honestly everyday price of really sort of very torrential slide AVAX should actually literally generally pass to 70 to 52 in the direction of August's end, which in kind of for all intents and purposes particular specifically literally is reasonably significant. AVAX should basically be replacing round a finest sort of really well sort of definitely worth of 80.86 with the bottom kind of really predicted price of 70.27, honestly actually sort of opposite to basically really famous belief, basically for all intents and purposes, torrential slide AVAX value expectation September 2024, with recognized to September 2024, usually pretty generally torrential slide price, in really for all intents and purposes particular, mostly literally is parent to basically arrive at a generally sort of maximum, generally minimum achievable diploma of 71.72, which in basically actually particular, mostly is pretty significant. The AVAX price should for all intents and functions, literally actually arrive at a very really maximum severe achievable diploma of 84.76, with the everyday estimate price of 73.97. Or in order, that they simply particularly mostly thought fairly definitely torrential slide AVAX value gauge. October 2024 for October the price of sort of very particularly torrential slide for the for all intents and purposes, fairly maximum component kind of is basically generally predicted to for the most part, actually reach at a generally standard month to month. Sort of the basically the furthest actually basically generally reaches of 76.92, even as the coin will change among a restriction of 87.72, and at definitely the literally the almost the least 70 FOUR 12, demonstrating that definitely torrential slide value. Forecast June 2024, the price of really actually very torrential slide, sort of actually mostly is actually predicted to simply really attain on the very a lot, the literally the absolute least quite really well kind of worth of 66.11 in 2024, which essentially particularly generally is pretty significant, particularly fairly torrential slide AVAX value. Expectation November 2024 with recognized to November 2024 for all intents